I'm Rabbi Julia Andelman, Director of Community Engagement at JTS, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's session of our fall series, 6 days shall you labor, perspectives on work in Jewish text and tradition. Special welcome to any first-time attendees today. We're so pleased to have Dr. Shira Epstein, who's Dean of the Davidson School of Education here at JTS. And her session is A Nice Jewish Teacher, How American Elementary Education Became Women's, quote unquote, women's work. This is such a relevant question. I know, I'm sure many or all of you like me are listening to podcasts and reading articles about how the professions that are really suffering in the pandemic, the professions that have had a mass exodus, professions where women and minorities have suffered inordinately. So I feel that this question is so relevant to our moment today. So I'm so pleased that Dr. Epstein is addressing it today. And even just last week, my son asked me, why are all my teachers women? And I said, I will be able to tell you after Monday's webinar. We're really grateful also to our sponsors for today's session. At the Tzaddik level, Jane and Rabbi Jerry Epstein, in honor of their daughter, Dean Shira Epstein, and her teaching today, as well as at the Chacham level, Emily and Howard Gans, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, in memory of their parents, Miriam and Abe Gans, and Molly and Jack Raymond. Thank you so much to all of you for making this session today possible. And for anyone else who's feeling inspired by this learning with JTS faculty, we invite you to partner with us by sponsoring a learning session. We have 3 different levels which are in the chat, and please be in touch with us to learn more at learninglives@jtsa.edu. All right, I would like to turn it over now to Tani Schwarzerman to give us some additional information.
Thank you, Rabbi Andelman. Dr. Shira Epstein will pause for questions periodically throughout the class. We also have a Q&A period at the end. And you can use your chat feature to submit your questions to Rabbi Julia Andelman. During the Q&A period, Rabbi Andelman will select a few questions to present to Dr. Epstein. For any technical or logistical questions, you can initiate a private chat with either myself or Lynn Feynman. The sources for today's class were in the email that you received with a Zoom link for the session, and we'll be screen sharing them as well. So pleased to introduce Dr. Shira Epstein, Dean of the William Davidson Graduate School of Jewish Education and Assistant Professor of Jewish Education. Dr. Epstein has received multiple fellowships, grants, and awards in the field, and has published numerous articles and lectured widely about issues in Jewish education and gender equity. Pleased to turn it over to Dr. Epstein.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tani. Thank you, Julia. I am thrilled to be with you all today. I thoroughly enjoyed our time. For those of you who are in last February's community engagement lecture, this is a very different lecture, but also around issues of gender in education that will emerge. So I am really just thrilled for this opportunity to discuss what I'm passionate about. So we're going to be, for those of you who already looked through the sources, there are different kind of sources. They're not traditional Jewish sources, Jewish text sources. They come largely from general education from 1920s and 1930s in New York City, education, and we'll be parsing them out and talking through what is the relevance for us today. So we're going to start off with source number 1, and we can have that up on the screen, or you can look down at your own sources. Okay, so this is as cited, I'm going to pull widely from 2 books. One is by Kate Rusmanier, who is a historian, City Teachers, Teaching and School Reform in Historical Perspective, and another source that I'll talk through in a few minutes. This is a poem from 1926. From the Brooklyn Teachers Association 52nd Annual Report. So let's look at it together. 50 years a toiling teacher, many pings she knew, sacrificed a happy fireside, asked for pleasures few. Proudly she when duty beckoned, rendered service true. So you just heard me read it aloud. You have it in front of you. We're going to open up the chat for like a minute. And the chat now, it will be closed at all other times in this lecture, but right now it's open. And I want you to just, it can be 2 words or 5 words, really not a lot. Respond to this prompt. What does this poem suggest? What were the valued qualities of an American teacher in 1926? What were the valued qualities of an American teacher? And please put them in the chat. And I'm going to just pause and be quiet for like 30 seconds while you post. Okay, so you can keep posting until the chat is closed. I'm not going to be able to look at them all right now, but Rabbi Anzelman will look them through, and if there are questions that tie in, I'm sure she will definitely tie this together. So some of the things I'm seeing are dedication, time. This is time, selfless service. Yes, teachers were women, not married. Proudly she. Okay, and obviously I'm leading the witness here because you know the title of this session, but self-sacrifice, a teacher was a woman, not a man. Yep, self-sacrifice, dedication, these are the words that I am seeing. I'm seeing them many times. It's interesting, unmarried. We will get to that in a couple of minutes, but that's what some people are reading in here. But I'm seeing the words dedication and selfless and sacrifice, low paid. We will talk about that today. That's not explicitly said in this poem, but it's definitely looming in the background. Can't have it all, called as a duty, human sacrifice. Okay, and working hard. Now, I'm sure that there is more, but what it comes up for me is, yes, the word sacrifice is in this poem, and it was named. Dedication is what people saw, that it was a duty. That word is in the poem too. Okay, so we can take off the source page. And I'm going to briefly intro what this lecture is about. We will explore the taken for granted ways that we still hold on to ideals of teaching as a feminized profession. Its origins in professionalization of public school teachers in the early 20th century, primarily the 1920s and 1930s, particularly in New York City, and how this intersected with views of the modernized Jewish woman and American women. What happens when we examine the discourses, ways of being that we take for granted of teaching that took hold in America in the 1920s and 1930s, and then look at the resonances now about 100 years later in Jewish education? I'll get to that second part towards the end of our time together. One of the other books I'm going to be drawing upon that is quoted in your sources is called My Daughter, the Teacher. It came out in 1993. It's by Ruth Jacknow Markowitz. I love this book for many, many reasons, but what she names in the introduction is sociologists tend to make the teacher the object rather than the subject of study when we think about teaching, barely acknowledging the significance of gender. The experience of teachers and their own viewpoints are not present. So this is really striking for me. And what she looks at in her book is the experience of teachers, and what we're going to talk about in the few minutes. What's fascinating, I live in New York City. I do not think by any means New York City is the end of the earth. But we will be looking at New York City public school teachers in the 20s and 30s for a very clear reason, which I'll explain more in a minute. So her book is looking at these teachers and their experiences. She interviewed them and looking at teaching through a gender lens. And this is really what I advocate for. when we look at education through a gender lens, what we see that is otherwise obscured from view. So really to bookmark that, that's what we're going to keep coming back to in our time together. So to know, why are we looking at this time period? Why the 20s and 30s in New York City? So to know, Jewish women comprised 26% of the new teachers in New York City public schools during the 1920s. By 1930, this is striking, and a lot of people don't know this, they made up 44% of those joining New York City public school teaching staff. By the 1940s, 56% of the new teachers were Jewish. So what we're going to be unpacking in the first part of our time together is, so what was mapped on to Jewish women during this time period as we professionalize what it meant to be a teacher. We will be looking at ideas of teacher as mother figure, which came up even in the short poem that you saw, and the ideas of the ideal, specifically novice teacher, someone who's new to the profession, and how we learn from that and how we can take from that, from the ways we talk about Jewish education today, and how we're trying to, the big issue right now across Jewish education is specifically how we're expanding the pipeline of Judaic studies teachers in day schools and beyond, synagogue schools, and where we might be not realizing it, drawing from some of these discourses, and what happens when we look closely at the way that we describe the kind of teachers that we want. So Tanya, if you could please put up source number 2. Okay, and this is quoting, it's not necessarily a Jewish teacher, but I am really taken with this quote from Isabel Ennis, who was the first woman president of the Brooklyn Teachers Association. We are expected to be an arithmetician, a historian, a grammarian, a disciplinarian, a librarian, a sociologist, a penman, an artist, a musician, a model, a moralist. I feel like I just need to pause and take a deep breath. An attendance officer, a clerk, a nurse, a banker, an athlete, a dancer, a supervisor of play and recreation, an engineer, a community center worker. Are we exhausted yet by looking at this list of what teachers were expected to be? A farmer, a housekeeper, a medical and sanitary inspector, a host or a hostess. We are expected to discover the mentally deficient, the deaf, the feeble-minded, the exceptional, and a few more just such. Besides the 3 R's, okay, so I just want to note that what's 5 lines down here is what we think that a teacher is supposed to be doing, or at least I do. Besides the 3 R's, we are expected to teach thrift, self-government, and sex hygiene. We must be resourceful, display initiative, have confidence in ourselves, make our teaching attractive. In fact, the demand is so great, teachers hardly know what to slur or what to stress in teaching. So this is from 1918. Okay, we can take off the source sheet. I bring this quote forth to really foreground all that we're going to talk about today. Why is it that we expect teachers to be this catch-all of everything? And why is it that when it comes to looking at them as a profession, we sometimes bury within a large laundry list what actually the profession is? We're going to be thinking about the discourse of teaching as natural Jewish women's work and how it emerged here. The socio-historical conditions were right for Jewish girls to go to school and get the education to become the next generation of teachers. So I just want to talk about this for a couple of minutes. I am not an educational historian. I do not purport to be, but it's really important to understand what were some of the forces, and I'm giving a very quick overview. What were some of the forces that led to Jewish teachers stepping into this role in such vast numbers in the 20s and 30s? So first of all, many of you know there was an influx of immigration right previous to this time, specifically to New York City. And they were coming largely from Eastern Europe, where there had just been the Haskalah, the Enlightenment movement. And this shaped in Eastern Europe, and this is a really facile overview, but it's really important to note if we're going to talk about Jewish teachers at this time period, women as learners, and thus as educators of learners. So really previous to this time, you wouldn't have been really talking about females as learners in the Jewish community, and they wouldn't have been going on to even a high school education, but they were coming to the States in vast numbers. And at this time, when high school was expanding as something that was formalized in New York City, the literacy rate for Jewish immigrants to the US was one of the highest of all immigrant populations. So here we had all these immigrants coming. Jewish girls were at a higher literacy rate, which meant that they were going on to actual high school, which eventually became a precursor to being a teacher or necessary qualification. There was a quote in one of the books, and this is, "Land on Saturday, settle on Sunday, school on Monday." And really, this is what took hold. You know, we think of ourselves as, you know, Jewish people of the book, literacy, but we were strivers, and we came here, and it really was like you would go and you would sign up for school. In 1908, already about a third of New York City school children were Jewish. And we also have to know that by the 20s and 30s, we were already in approaching a second generation of immigrants who had already seen their mothers be garment workers. They wanted more. So this was a stepping stone into the modern world. So at the same time, there was a great need for more teachers because we had all these immigrants aside from Jewish Americans, and they needed to go somewhere. The city's population grew from 4.5 million in 1910 to 7 million in 1930. So you needed somewhere for these kids to go during the day. And as this was happening, there were more openings for teachers. You have more kids in school, you need more teachers. And Jewish young women were ready to train for these novice teachers' roles. At the same time, I didn't quite realize this until I was reviewing all the historical insights, that Hunter College started off as a teacher training program. You had others, but Hunter College, Brooklyn College, and these were teacher training programs, and a lot of the people going into them were young Jewish women. We also need to know that there were no quotas at the time for Jewish teachers, where there were obviously quotas, as many of us know from our relatives, for other professions. And so how did this converge with the feminization of teaching? As all this was happening, the novice teacher training and onboarding process was becoming professionalized and standardized. And through this, and we're going to look at it more closely in just a couple of minutes, through the standardization process, the ideas and values of the ideal teacher converge with ideas and values of the ideal American women. So the process of becoming a teacher became a process of conforming to these ideals and values, and it was really used as a gatekeeping. Through this gatekeeping of training, licensing, and hiring. So we formed ideals of the right kind of woman, American teacher in New York City as a Jewish woman. The discourse of teaching changed to frame teaching as women's work, when previously, again, if we think back to even like 70 years prior to that, it was intellectual, scholarly, manly work. Think back to this quote that we just read. What happened there? And we're going to parse this out more in our time together. It wasn't about 3 hours. That was one little piece of it. There were 100 other things that you were expected to do, and you were expected to learn to become the right teacher. Just to note, in Markowitz's book, My Daughter, the Teacher, these Jewish girls were framed as subway scholars, right? Because they were taking the subway to go to study, and they were studying on the subway. And that was a phrase that was used. So we had this discourse emerging of the Jewish teacher as an energized, patriotic American. And this is why Jewish women were proud to be at the intersection of these cultural changes. we see this through the gatekeeping of in New York City of novice teachers, as I just said, the entrance exams. There was a personal evaluation from the training school dean. There was a written examination. And in addition to demonstrating subject matter knowledge and child development, we'll get to this in a few minutes, they had to understand contagious diseases. And then there was also an oral examination for the teaching license so we could hear her voice. There's a lot of documentation that those, so we could make sure that she didn't have an accent. He wanted to make sure she did not have an Eastern European accent, that she was going to be American through and through. So we're going to look at source 3. Source 3 is taken from Markowitz, My Daughter, the Teacher. The candidate was judged on her appearance, neatness, reading, energy, and alertness. And I'm really trying to have you notice here, the 3 R's again is buried within all of this. What was she supposed to be was an almost impossible ideal. Her voice was supposed to be audible, pleasant, and very well modulated without being nasal, high-pitched, monotonous, strident, or noisy, and ought to inspire confidence, not fear. In other words, a teacher's voice had to be capable of being heard with pleasure, not with pain. So she had to be confident, but she couldn't be too strident. We'll talk in a few minutes about she was supposed to be a disciplinarian, but not too much of a disciplinarian. So, you know, when I talk about gender, we talk a lot, and those of you who have studied gender studies, women's studies before, there's always a double bind when it comes for women, what she's supposed to be. Her speech was to be clearly articulated, grammatical, and free from vulgarisms and foreignisms. Any student whose speech was deemed defective, of poor quality, or having a foreign accent was screened by officials in their teacher training programs. Sometimes her admission was contingent upon her losing her accent. So all this was even just to get into training program what she had to be weeded out so that she would be the proper role model for Americans. There was a personal interview with the Board of Examiners. And then we had to make sure that she could be a proper disciplinarian. So I'm keeping this up because we're going to look now at source number 4. And I want to foreground this by saying, when I started teaching full time, I just turned 25, and I still won't forget that first day at the end of the day when I was on dismissal duty. And one of the administrators who didn't really know me looked at me and said, "Oh, the 8th graders are over there." I looked very young. I am very blessed. I still look younger than my age, but so you can imagine 25 years ago, I looked very young, and I was told to stand on the side until I said, "No, I'm a teacher." And actually, so when I look at this quote, we're going to look at it in just a couple of minutes. It brings up a lot when I think about my own experience, anecdotal, of course, not, empirically based, but I am an N=1 of what it meant to have gone through, had an MA, and standing there my first day and being told that I wasn't an authoritative presence. So Ruth Gold had hoped to teach high school chemistry, but a Hunter College dean told her that because she was only 4 feet 9 inches, she would never obtain such a position, but should instead teach kindergarten, where the height regulation was also waived. So there was a height regulation. Let's just think about that for a minute. And for a Jewish woman who usually was shorter, this already was a barrier. Achieving full appearance could also be a detriment, and Etta Ginsburg was also prevented from teaching in the high schools because her appearance belied her age. Her advisory claimed that the examiners would be prejudiced by her appearance, which was closer to that of a student than a teacher, nor would they believe she could maintain discipline, so she too was slotted to teach kindergarten. Alleged obesity also barred many from teaching, as it did one woman who at 5 feet 2 inches and 165 pounds was denied a license. Okay, we can take this off. So again, to foreground here, we're talking about teachers, and just think to yourself, think about what other professions maybe in the 20s and 30s where one would have been judged first and foremost on their appearance and how it would have been a detriment to them moving forward. There was this double bind. The teachers were meant to build their classrooms as mini homes and at the same time needed to elevate the status of the profession. So this is really where we're seeing that there was a discourse of teacher as mother was starting to emerge. And that's the other layer we're bringing into here. So keeping all this in mind, and in a little bit, we will pause for questions, but we're threading the needle here around all of these pieces of what an American teacher was supposed to be that was being mapped onto majority Jewish teachers. Of course, and we'll just name it because it came up around that little poem. Pretty much everyone, I'm not saying any new news, but we need to name that it was attractive to have females as teachers because they would accept a lower pay. They would keep costs down for schools. So there is, again, this added layer that I'm going to talk at the end still holds for us, even those of us who want to feel that we've moved beyond this, as teachers doing this for the love of the work, not necessarily for the pay. At this time, you would be doing it maybe for pin money. Pin money was right, like extra money for the family. This wouldn't be, you wouldn't be the sole breadwinner. So what was it supposed to be? What were they supposed to be doing? There was this double bind because on the one hand, women could have a moralizing effect, be mothers as teachers. And just to note, because some of you wrote it in the poem, and it's really interesting because it wasn't in the poem, so some of you were clearly mapping it onto the poem, your ideas about being married or not being married. This is a really important note also about what was happening in New York City. In most of the country, if you were married, you weren't allowed to be a teacher. There were laws about that. There were several reasons. One of them was you would be getting pregnant probably in your time. And in a lot of the country, it was thought that would be vulgar to see someone who was pregnant, to know that your teacher was actually having sex, was a sexual being. And so they weren't allowed. In New York City specifically, for a variety of reasons, married women were allowed to be teachers. And there were laws supporting that. And then there were maternity leave laws in New York City. So just to note this. So here we have, again, this double bind. She's likely getting married in her 20s. She's probably starting a family. She's supposed to be a good mother at home. But then in the classroom as well, she's supposed to be transferring that motherable skill and be a disciplinarian, but not too much of a disciplinarian. She's supposed to keep control, but not be harsh. She has to be soft in her tone. So there's this one hand, women's having a moralizing effect. It would be great to have these women as teachers. They're going to Americanize these unruly immigrants. On the other hand, there was this veneer of professionalism and the reputation of a teacher that they wanted to uphold as upscale, that separated it from other women's work, specifically domestic and clerical work. But how is the profession being framed? Again, think back to that first quote of the teacher was becoming a catch-all for social service agent. There was very little time in actuality for being an intellectual as teacher because you had to be all these other things. And we'll talk specifically about what some of those things were in a few minutes. So this became teacher not only as mother, but it was their patriotic responsibility for enculturation of the next generation of American citizens. Quote, uninterested in financial rewards and oblivious to working conditions. And I know that there are some early childhood educators on this call, or former early childhood educators. We'll get to that towards the end of what still resonates today. But those of you who have been in elementary and specifically early childhood education, just think for yourself what sounds familiar here. We're supposed to do it for the love of the craft and pay. You'll get paid. So there's a dissonance and rupture. On the one hand, promoting the image of the generous and caring teacher, and the realities of the schools that were demeaning and degrading in so many ways. And again, we'll look at that specifically, but they were crowded, they were noisy, teachers had a massive load, they were supposed to be doing a lot of extra work for free. And I argue that this contributed to a perpetual double bind that these female teachers were engaged in and continues today. So this double bind of the ideal versus real, this is source number 5, and it's a cartoon. It was the National Education Association Research Bulletin. It's called Spring Vacation. So look really closely at it. And just note, we're not going to note in the chat, but make a note for yourself of what you see. Okay, you have on the right side the school teacher. Notice her dress, notice her hat, notice her beautiful bob and her smile. And she's taking some, luxury reading, and she's got her gorgeous suitcase and her heels, and she's going off on spring vacation. Now let's look at the left side. It's so sad. It's the rest of us. And look at their faces. They are miserable. There's a nurse in the background saying pretty soft. There's clerical workers. There's a woman who's either a librarian or some other secretarial staff holding about 10 books. There's someone who looks like she hasn't combed her hair in 10 days. There's someone else at the typewriter with mounds of work. There's someone holding dirty dishes. And they're all looking at this teacher breezing off for spring break. Pretty soft. I love this cartoon for so many reasons, because the premier one for me is that it captures so well this double bind. If we look at who is portrayed on the right, she doesn't read as Jewish, right? She's the ideal. She is the ideal of someone who has enough money to dress like that, to go away on spring vacation. And the other women on the other side are the women who are in these clerical positions, or these nursing, other things that actually Jewish women couldn't get jobs in, so they were teachers. And then what bind is she in? She has a job or she has spring vacation. We're likely she wasn't going anywhere. But the view of her as soft, as easy breezy, and as the ideal candidate. The ideal candidate for being a novice teacher was young, white, neatly dressed, alert, cultured, without doubt of, anglicized, and that was the school teacher. So what was made invisible by this discourse of the ideal teacher as American, wholesome, independent, were the realities of the role. And this captures right here why I think it's so important always to bring in a gender lens when we are talking about teaching, because it can become obscured by our inner feelings of what is the ideal teacher. The realities of the role are what I just named. That it was overburdened. You likely weren't getting paid a lot. You weren't probably going anywhere on spring break. You weren't dressing like that. But the ideal is easy breezy gig, easy breezy, effortless. And notice she's not got a gaggle of kids around her. She's probably single in this cartoon, which likely was not the case. So we can take the image off. Teaching would then become a model of gatekeeping for the right kind of professional woman, this ideal. The ideal. And then what I am arguing is, sorry, I have sun coming in my window, which is lovely. I'm just going to tilt myself a little bit. Second generation immigrant who needed to constantly contort to conform to this impossible ideal. So I'm going to pause here. And Julia, if there are some, I assume there are some questions emerging. Happy to hear some of them.
Great, thank you. You didn't mention that in the cartoon, all the women on the left also have a ball and chain around their ankles.
Right, they were stuck this teacher, she goes on spring break. And for those of you who are in education, I've experienced this my whole life too. I think about my earlier days as a classroom teacher, and I had spring break and I had winter break. And the people around me in my circle who were in other professions, they would just roll their eyes. Oh, easy breezy for you, right? So what still holds true today?
All right, we have lots of great questions. Well, I guess one kind of fundamental question, you talked a lot about how women were allowed to or ended up coming into the profession. I don't know if you addressed explicitly why men weren't as much. If you can address that.
Absolutely can. So prior to this, men were primarily teachers. And around this time, as high school became a thing, right? Professionalized, standardized. It's a lot of what we might see around us today. Men were brought into high school teaching with a higher salary, and less of that was open to women. So there were still male teachers, but fewer and fewer were going into elementary teaching. And again, it's probably a lot of what we'd expect, that as the salaries for elementary education became lower and lower, I would say, I'm looking at New York City right now, but this was across the country. It's what we see in a lot of professions. As any profession becomes, quote, feminized or seen as women's work, then we have this cycle, right, where the pay becomes less than, because it's seen again at this time where you had women that were then becoming married. It's what I said before, that it was thought of as luxury money. Even if that wasn't the case, that's the way it was thought. So there are other reasons, but I would say the more, if we think back to that very first poem and it's named as she, that often, and we see it again and again, becomes a detractor as any profession is named as a female profession, right? We've seen it with nursing too, which is coming around in a different way in the past decade or so. But, if we think about all of our youth, how nursing was largely framed, then it was a similar sort of thing. You wouldn't have seen men going into it because it was thought of as a female profession. The same with clerical work, domestic work.
So there's a tipping point and then it's self-fulfilling.
Mm-hmm.
There were various questions about what other professions were closed to women in general, or to Jewish women specifically. You mentioned with the cartoon, those were professions Jewish women couldn't have gotten anyway, largely. If you could comment a little bit about that, what was even open to women / Jewish women?
Yeah. So, and also what I found in the sources, which is really interesting, is I actually would have to look back to see, were there quotas in nursing? A lot of what I saw was actually in the Jewish world. You wouldn't want whereas my daughter, the teacher, that was considered a very esteemed thing. That's what I love so much about the book. It was thought of as like, wow, I can brag about my daughter, the teacher, in the Jewish world. For those of us who, read Marjorie Morningstar, right? That was the idea. But nursing actually in the Jewish world, like, that wasn't something for a nice Jewish girl. You wouldn't want that. There was, as I mentioned, the moms of these young women, if they were working, they were probably in a sweatshop in the garment industry. We know that. But then there were very few professions open to women in general. I mean, you might have some one-offs here and there, but it would have been these other things like clerical work, stenographer, and those they just weren't open. There were quotas. So that was largely it: nursing, domestic work, clerical work, teaching. again, not to say that you couldn't find examples in our own, probably people on this lecture, you have family members who did other things, but that would have been the big ones.
Okay. They're just, people are sharing so many interesting personal experiences. I wish I could share them all, but this one really jumped out at me. This person wrote, "I'm a professor emerita, but at least once a year, a student, a little distracted, would call me mommy." It just goes to what you were saying about, the expectation of creating this, sort of creating a home culture in the classroom, which presumably had not been the expectation of male teachers.
Correct. And when the next part of our time together, we'll actually be looking at more fully how the teaching profession was designed to promote this, because you had to do all the things that if your mother wasn't working, that she was at home, she was a homemaker. And we all well know that requires a vast skill set of a lot of hidden work. And the same thing was emerging in teaching as well. That's right. But what we'll come back to at the very end were the qualities. So it's not surprising to me that happened to me too. And I certainly, in my earliest years when I was teaching in the classroom, there would be kids that would, call me mommy, want to give me hugs, right? Like, and that was, I'm not, for many kids, that was a great thing, right? When many of us who have kids, we want to find teachers who are nurturing. So it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is interesting to note what might still be residue today for when we say that we want to professionalize the field, what we're looking for in the qualities, right? In the qualities of a teacher.
Some of the other personal anecdotes that people shared about their own experiences, or in some cases their mothers, or about having to hide being pregnant even into the 70s. This person was saying pregnant women would have to take leave. Also, people trying to sound less Jewish in their interviews. So that's a little bit different from what you were saying. One person asked, what wasn't the screening interview sometimes used to eliminate Jews?
Yes. So that was part of what I was getting at before in sharing all these, oral exams. They would actually have them pronounce words. So you would pronounce a word to see, did they have a Yiddishism to it? Did they have specifically an Eastern European accent? And if so, that could be a reason for not giving them a teaching license or not allowing them to have access to a job. You wouldn't want that because, again, what was I love the phrase mapped on to Jewish women as teachers, teaching in general at this time is, again, and we'll see it in a couple of minutes, you had immigrant populations that were living in tenements, specifically in New York City. If we think about, they were very crowded, there was disease, and the teachers were becoming these on the vanguard and gatekeepers for hygiene. So part of that also had to be that you were going to teach these immigrants how to be American, which would be clean and high level.
All right, so maybe just just one or two more questions. So when someone asked what was the role of the Depression in increasing numbers of women in the teaching profession, if any?
So I'm really just thinking back because, again, I'm not a historian, but I will say that what I do recall from these accounts was that, as you can imagine, that if there was any family where there was only one worker in the family, especially in New York City, where you would be looking for a second income, it would be appealing to have your wife, or some of these women then delayed actually marriage in the 20s to a later time so that they could build up money to then start a family.
And then the last thing I'll share for now is someone pointed out that especially at the beginning of the 20th century, where you had a lot of universities not admitting women, if you were a woman who cared about education and was an intellectual, maybe this was, one of the few paths available to you to kind of stay in the sphere of learning.
To stay in the sphere of learning, and also I'll talk about it a little bit because this could be a whole lecture in itself. As we know, women in New York City prior to this time were on the, big in unions. They made big changes and advocated for changes that we saw in the garment industry and other industries, right? They were very active. This was socialist leaning. This ended up a little bit working, not a little bit, it ended up working against them, as we'll see in a few minutes, because then there were all these laws put in place to make sure that they weren't communist and red and that they were actual patriots. But that, sorry, can you reframe what led into this? Because I just lost my train of thought. Julia, what were you saying? What did you?
About universities not being open to women.
Oh, right. So you did have, not only did they want to, you're absolutely right, this would be a way to be intellectual, and most of them, the documents showed, would go into this and stay in it until they retired. Right? This was a way of making a difference, and really saw themselves, many of them were working in places like Harlem, in poor communities, trying to really be on the cusp of social change and advocating for the poor, and saw a way of doing it, but also, now I'm recalling where I went around unions, that it was a way of being an activist, which was important in the Jewish world, and was an important value, and where you could make change. And so we'll see that in a few minutes. You already saw that some of these people went on to be union leaders, to be big in the teaching unions, went to meetings after a long day of teaching or school at Hunter or wherever else they were, then went to their organizing meetings.
Do you want to go?
Well, we can take one more question, sure.
Well, someone actually asked specifically about unions, and it's more a question about now than then, but the person was asking, are female teachers perhaps in a better position now, now that belonging to a union is so standard? It doesn't seem like it so much, but
not in the Jewish
relative.
world. Not in the Jewish world, So, like, right. For those of us who are involved in day school education or synagogues, what union do we belong to? But yes, I would say let's bookmark, because in this time, as we're all reading the papers and all tapped in, or many of us are a part of this, right? Like, seeing, as you started off, like, jobs are open. Where is the push for thinking about what is the demand of any worker, but I would say teachers who are particularly beleaguered during COVID, and particularly early childhood educators who had to take a profession that is so built on the socialization and face-to-face, and they had no choice but to do it online. And what were the demands and the obstacles that were put on them that they had no choice but to rise above? So great. So now, thank you, Julia. So we'll move at another point. Keep thinking of your questions. I think that this is going to add another layer to some of the things that you're asking and thinking about. We are primed for the discourse of Jewish New York City teachers as the right role model, and not only mother, but I'm going to use the word efficient mother. They can get it done. Right? The discourse of the 24/7 boundless energy teacher, all accessible. For those of you who are involved in teaching now, there's an added layer that didn't even exist when I first went into teaching, of being accessible on email or text or on the portal of the school, right? So when are you supposed to be available? But here's the mother, a superwoman. So again, going back to that cartoon we just saw, you're supposed to be all sides of this ideal. The value above all of personal qualities, I just also want to put in here this discourse, temperamental makeup. Now, I will come back to this at the end, this is not, I don't want you to, I mean, you can think whatever you want, but I think it's important to say my values. Temperament, of course, is important. And for particular jobs, they're more important than others. And always we should be looking at the whole person. What does it mean when specifically for Jewish teachers at this time and then at other times with teaching, we're elevating the personal qualities maybe over other things, such as your training, as you just said, Julia, your intellectual abilities and abilities to make that accessible in the classroom. The Vermont superintendent in 1919 really talked about a good teaching personality. So yes, but what do we still associate with what is the right personality for being a teacher and how it might be feminized? Herbert Hoover said, a public character under the most searching scrutiny of watchful and critical eyes. So here we come into what was converging with a movement called social efficiency at this time. For anyone here who's studied in, industrialization, this was the factory model that was given primacy, was considered, you know, a way of getting more done, and how this got layered onto teachers. And then this, again, from Herbert Hoover, under the most searching scrutiny of a watchful and critical eyes. So how at this time, the exams, the tests, the oral and written exams, as well as what you had to keep submitting to, things that we take for granted now about giving in your lesson plans for review. Again, not necessarily a bad thing, but what does it mean that teachers at this time particularly were under constant surveillance to make sure that they were being the most efficient? There was a rating scale in New York City for promotion. So once you had the job, how you would get promoted, and looking at use of voice, cheerfulness, courtesy, self-control, initiative, tact, sympathy. But on top of that, things like time clocks, coming into being in school, in public schools. You had to be punctual. Again, that's fine for any job, but what did it mean that they were under, that was used for promotion under constant surveillance, cooperative, and then loyalty. So social efficiency, the dominant reform movement of the 1920s, that schools would eliminate waste and disorder. So schools, what I'm sharing here is, and then there's this whole other layer of what big, you know, if you think about, if you walk around in your urban era, there are still some school buildings left from this time. They're very big, right? Because you had a lot of immigrants and you had to figure out how to manage them during the day. So the school had to be used as a factory. And the teacher is going to become the manager of this. I didn't give this source, but you can just listen. This is from the 1930s from the Board of Education. There was a drill for what was called hygiene position. So the teacher not only had to be efficient in her work, but then she also had to be efficient in managing the hygiene of these kids. And the poem is this: roll up sleeves, extend head backward and turn face from light, draw down collar with hand nearer the window, keep elbow at side and fingers fully extended, place other hand over the head and draw up the hair above and behind the ear, display teeth and gums. And the last word is smile. So not only are you supposed to be checking for lice or checking for a disease and doing all these things as part of your repertoire, but you're supposed to do it with a smile, and you're supposed to do it easily and effortlessly. Things that we take for granted today as part of the constructs of schooling, we often don't think about until we look through a gender lens that they are constructs. So for example, something like homeroom. Just think for yourself, how many here was ever a part of a homeroom, or whose kids or grandkids are a part of a homeroom? That's something that was constructed. It's not a natural thing that has to be a part of schooling, but there had to be a home base. And the teacher was the manager of that homeroom. That was their home base. And in that homeroom, in this small space with up to 40 students, the teacher was expected to maintain control, engage in clerical tasks, which were a must at the beginning of the day, such as attendance. For those of you who are in school, even when I was working in the mid-90s, we still had those Delaney cards, right? They fit into little pockets and you would keep attendance. You would also have health records. You were expected to call home about absenteeism. So you had extra duties like supervising lunchroom that came in now. Again, we take these things for granted that they're a part of a teaching job. Think back to that again, second source, all those things we take for granted, but they happened during this time. And again, we're mapped onto these Jewish teachers because you needed someone to do all these things with all these people in the school. You had to stay in the schoolyard, distribute and mend books, hand letter diplomas. You had to pay from your own pocket for school supplies. Does that sound familiar to anyone from today who's in teaching? We're often still expected to do that. No free periods for planning. And then in 1929 to 1932, there was a health campaign that the teachers were expected to facilitate. And as a teacher, you were expected to contribute 1% of your salary minimum, then 3%, and then 5% to the school relief fund. Things that we take for granted today, like getting milk in school, really great things that a school does now as a social service agency. And we know that for many people, especially in New York City, we see it in our neighborhood, that there are kids that's where they're getting their meals during the day. This is a wonderful thing. What I want us to note is where teachers were expected to be a part of supporting this, giving of their salaries, distributing the milk, keeping records on the milk, and also the fund distributed eyeglasses, shoes, clothing, car fare, incidentals. And then for those of you who are asking before about the Depression, this intersects with that as well, right? Because you had more kids that were of need and the teachers had to be supporting this. And then that social efficiency, you would do things like provide extracurricular activities. Again, we take it for granted now. Again, a wonderful thing that a school provides, but now at least most schools give teachers extra pay for doing these things, Jewish day schools as well, but then you were expected to do it. You put in a long day and you were expected to stay. You were expected to be disciplinarians, but again, think back to that double bind, not too much disciplinarians, but disciplinarians. And as I said a few minutes ago, this aligns with views of teachers as a paragon for patriotism. So there were teachers unions. You were supposed to be disciplinarians, but again, don't be too uppity, right? You can be involved, but don't be too involved. In 1925, Jewish women composed 50% of the union's executive board. In 1921, the Lusk laws were passed, requiring all public school teachers to be loyal and obedient to the governments of New York State and the US. In 1934, after the repeal of the Lusk laws, the Ives Laws were created, forcing all teachers to take a loyalty oath. Okay, so again, this double bind. You were meant to be involved. You were meant to go above and beyond the call of duty in your school. But don't be an activist, because then you are going to be seen as too involved. And then, of course, we know in the 1950s, incited by the anti-red hysteria, many were fired. Many of these because the Jewish women were the majority of teachers at that time, and because many of them were involved in unions. All of the teachers that fired during these years, actually, records show, were Jewish, and all were members of the teachers union. So what does this layer on here? Especially as many of these families came from families with socialist leanings. This was a pride. We were pride to bring down these values, pass down these values, but it could also work against you. So this brings us to source number 6. And Atani, if you wouldn't mind putting that up. I didn't put the whole article here, but I do reference it and you can look it up on your own. It's from September 6, 2014. The same question, why don't more men go into teaching? This was asked at the beginning of the lecture. So I want us to note the title of our article and the photo that the New York Times uses. Why this photo is the question that I would ask. If we're asking the question in the New York Times in 2014, why don't more men go into teaching? I argue we are asking this question and reinforcing the outmoded ideas of what it means to be a teacher. So it's perpetual and we are part of perpetuating it. We look in this photo. This is a photo, it's all white kids actually. Doesn't really look like a diverse classroom. And you have the woman in the background wearing this beautiful dress, keeping order. And I pose it as a question, why is this the image that was chosen? Why don't more men go into teaching? We in the Jewish world, I would say, even with changing ideas of diversity, equity, inclusion, in some ways, we still keep this image in the background of our schools as a place where kids are sitting at desks, where there is a mother figure on the side who is doing it for the joy and the love of teaching. She's not necessarily an intellectual, but she loves her work. We can take this source 6 down. And the question of dispositions of teachers. I would hold the question today. I'm a big fan of the frame dispositions. It's not just, what skills do we want for teachers, but what approaches, what are the ways of being, again, aligning with discourses that we want of teachers, and what do we still map onto teachers today? So really briefly, I think it's important to note because there's some really interesting quotes in it, and we can share afterwards. I wrote a commentary. There was a study that came out this summer. It's really the major study of the trajectory of Jewish teachers. It's from the Collaborative for Applied Studies in Jewish Education, CASG, and there's different parts of the study, but there's one particularly called Mapping the Marketplace that looks a lot at why people go into teaching, but more so what educators are looking for. In particularly novice, not just teachers, but Jewish educators defined in the study of someone who is really most of the time with learners in a setting. So a lot of it is about classroom teachers. And what really struck me when I looked at this study is, yes, there's the data, but again, I am always interested in the language that we use. And the language really sticks out for me that we're still saying things like we want creative, dynamic, and engaging, which again, I will say I'm all for all of those things. And I myself as an educator, I think I'm creative, dynamic, and engaging. But what happens when we push that above actually the training and the intellectual rigor and seeing teachers as a profession, as any other profession? One of the educators interviewed who's quoted in the study says, if they're not relatable and if they're not a role model, it's not going to work. Also, if they don't really love it. So yeah, that's what our hiring is based. I look less for degrees. I look more at the person. Again, all those things are wonderful to be looking at the person. I often think about what do we expect of our teachers, or maybe even particularly of our Jewish teachers, because we're passing along tradition and continuity and all those things that we want, that maybe we don't expect from other professions. Last week, I was looking for a new doctor, and I personally take for granted that in that profession, someone is going to love what they do. And that's not what I interview a doctor for. Do you love what you do? For me, that's taken for granted. I actually look at their degrees. I look at their training. I look at their backgrounds. I look at their track record. I look at where they work. I look at their reviews for have they been effective in what they do. So what does it mean when we say they need to really love it? And I look less for degrees. I look more at the person. There's a finding in the study that pedagogical, this is a quote, direct quote, pedagogical knowledge is valued everywhere across all school settings, although it often seems reduced to knowing, quote, how to hold a room, getting an idea across, and communicating, okay? And the study also says, finally, it is rare for employers to express a specific desire that candidates come with pedagogic content knowledge. So pedagogic content knowledge, just to pause, is that when you say you're teaching Bible, you have the content knowledge, you actually know Bible, and you know how to teach it. So what the study is saying is that employers look less for pedagogic content knowledge or know-how in these settings. There really does not seem to be a demand for knowledge. So again, in 2021, in the summer of 2021, this strikes me as someone who studies all of what I shared in this lecture. What does it mean that those who are hiring in Jewish education, and gender is never named as a lens in the study, are not really looking for people who have a pedagogic content knowledge or training. And in fact, it can work against them. One hirer said at one point that, you know, I want less someone who's coming with, I forgot the phrase that they use, but looking, they don't have a specific curriculum that they're coming in with. You know, they're more moldable, they're more malleable. So again, to be clear, I'm not suggesting that dispositions and relational ability should not be important characteristics, but what I am concerned about is someone who is at the head of a training program for Jewish educators, is that if we don't examine these belief systems that hold today, can we, or if we, on the other hand, if we do, what can we make visible in these problematics? Are we saying that educators have to be the impossible everything? And what are we missing when we don't look through this gender lens? And I believe that we are overlooking systemic ingrained views that need to be addressed to attract novice teachers, especially as what I hear every week. I'm getting job announcements. We want to expand the field. How do we attract new teachers? How do we attract inspiring Jewish educators for the 21st century? Well, then we need to think about what might be holding around what we're hiring for and how are we training. One last thing, two last things I want to say was particularly striking in the study, specifically around early childhood educators. Talk about the low pay. Someone asked before about low pay. This is a quote from the study. Staff are willing to tolerate these conditions either because they're not the primary breadwinners, that's the phrase that's used, in their families, because of the convenient alignment between work and their family lives, especially when so much of the work is part-time, or more elusively, because they formed bonds with these workplaces when their own children were younger. And so I hold it as a question, what happens when, again, as you noted earlier, Julia, it becomes perpetuating and self-fulfilling then that we have primarily married women in early childhood education because that's all who can afford to be in this profession, and women in general, because they're the only ones who will take $27,000 to $34,000 a year for being an expert in their fields, and that they're not divorced. We don't have solo parents, you know, maybe we have single people who don't have to worry about supporting a family, but we certainly have people who are more from upper class because they can afford to do this at low pay. And the last thing that I will share is anecdotal from my time before becoming dean for 15 years. I was facilitator of the pedagogy and teaching practicum here in our master's. teachers. That means all of our in-house students who did student teaching. And several of these were also people in rabbinical schools. So they would come to me as they were interviewing. So here's some of the things that I heard during this time from these rabbi/educators that would emerge in their interviews. Synagogues would ask, well, are you planning to have kids? And if so, how will you be the rabbi that we need? Or they'll say, are you planning to have kids? You know, because they don't have kids yet or they're not married. How will you be the model we need if not? I've heard from her solo parents of, as a solo mom, how will you do it all? And again, if we're going to ask these questions, do we ask them from all of our applicants is what I want to hold up. And how does this, you know, lay bare some of our ideas about what a woman, particularly who is an educational leader, needs to be. And as a woman in your 40s who's single without kids, we're trying to increase our family engagement exposure. How would you be that person because you don't have kids? So again, pointing out this is all anecdotal, but it all comes to me. And what are the double bind that women still in 2021 are in today as they seek to be educational leaders? So I'll end, and then we can take as many questions as we have time for to self-reflect and examine our gender discourses as we're looking to expand the pipeline of Jewish educators and particularly Jewish educational leaders. Thank you so much.
Let's not discount anecdotal evidence. I know on the women rabbi groups and listservs that I'm on, yeah, and endless reams of anecdotes that really add up about all kinds of double standards. Okay, so we have questions of a variety of different types, and why don't we start with day school, which came up briefly. So if you could speak more to the issue of right, things being worse for teachers in day schools in some ways. The lack of union, I don't know if there's something that someone asked, is there something that legally prevents day school teachers from unionizing? I don't know if you know about that, but just in general, if salary and benefits and working conditions are inferior to those in the public school systems, which many teachers seem to feel that they are, what does that say about our communal values and you know, and the sustainability of Jewish day schools, our ability to attract and retain highly qualified people? And I think this is, again, just going back to the pandemic, you know, seems more urgent than ever because people are leaving professions where they don't feel sufficiently valued.
Yeah, thank you for that. So there's lots of different things. I think my brain was flooded with so many things I could say because this is my profession and I don't just train for day school teachers. But as I shared, I've really been at the forefront of that for a large amount of my career, both as a classroom teacher and then in training of classroom teachers. So one thing I can share is when we hear a lot around gender equity now, for many of us, we're like, okay, we've heard it, we've gotten there, we're good. But so much of this, and I'm on a lot of listservs too, where there's still debate about salary transparency and really clear debate. I will tell you, in the Davidson School, we put out job announcements on Thursdays for our students and Friday for our alumni. And I'm really grateful to some organizations that came to us last year, and actually a few alumni. Intrepid alumni wrote to me and they said, you know, it's not okay that we looked through, there were about 10 job postings in 1 week, and not one of them had a salary range in them. And it was a few alumni who wrote to me together and said, this is not okay. And I will say, even as someone who is involved in this work, my first reaction is like, you're absolutely right, but most of them that we get don't have this. And then it's putting it on my assistant to have to write back. Like, I didn't mean to make an excuse, but like, I felt like I was then I realized that was part of the problem. And this only changes if we all agree to be a part of the change. So I will tell you, on a very technical change level, like those of us in the leadership, we talk about adaptive change and technical change. Adaptive change are the big changes, like how do we get to gender equity in Jewish education? And I'm a big fan for sometimes that happens from low-hanging fruit. The technical changes add up. So I feel really happy that I was able, from my perch, to say, we're making this technical change. And I had a conversation with my assistant and with my associate dean, and we agreed that we would screen every job posting we get for whether there was a salary range. I bring this up because what we found is, this is across all of Jewish education, you might imagine, but particularly, look, in the conservative rabbinical world, it's not exactly a union, but it operates somewhat like that, right? The RA, that postings now, they do have a salary range, but the ones on our listing that was going out to teachers did not. Most day schools do not include that until we started to ask for it. And slowly, it's starting to change. I will tell you that I get many that still do not include, and I'll write back to the school. And there's a whole litany of excuses of why it's not possible. Sometimes it's a part of a larger system where they're not doing it. Sometimes it's they're working through a search firm, and that doesn't work in the search firm's favor because they get a cut of like who's hired. But this is not exactly answering your question, but I bring this to say that I think particularly for day school teachers, part of the problem is that we've just accepted this. And I can tell you from my own negotiation for my very first job, my full-time classroom teaching job in 1996, that I fought tooth and nail for a couple $1,000 extra above the low 20,000s. And how did I take that as like, this is okay? It's because no one was talking about, even to get people who were in my circle to talk about what they were making was fairly impossible. So how do we change this? We change it by saying, we are all collectively going to raise the discourse and conversation. And part of that is by saying, we want to know what are standard salaries, what are salary ranges, and how do we work together to support each other in that? I think, that's a larger question. Why don't day schools have, there are some schools that have unions, but largely we don't, because each school is its own like little universe, right? But this is one way that we can make change, because we have to have deeper conversations. I'm sure it's shocking for people who aren't involved in early childhood education when I say the numbers of what teachers are paid, or maybe not getting benefits or not getting full benefits. And until we're willing to have that conversation, it's not going to change.
Can you talk a little bit more about, you were just talking about in your role as dean of the education school, how how you're working on these gender issues in some ways, gender parity. Could you also talk about the I'm trying to remember exactly the phrase you used, the subject matter expertise.
Pedagogical content knowledge, yeah.
Great. Do you, right, because you're bringing people here to train a JTS in pedagogy, and specifically in certain subfields of Jewish study and Jewish education. Do you feel that you're positioned to kind of raise the bar in terms of what schools are looking to hire, and to kind of push them to expect and look for that kind of expertise?
Yeah, and it's so interesting too, because I have a lot of even before I was dean, I would have a lot of schools contacting me. We're looking for this, this, and this. Can you help us? And it's, again, I will tell you, this impossible double bind, because they want, let's talk about Hebrew. Many day schools want fluent Hebrew teachers, which is a wonderful thing. But if you look closely in the school, often the schools that are looking for fluent Hebrew teachers, that's not necessarily what's happening, Ivrit in the classroom, but they want that. But they also want someone who's younger and newer, maybe it isn't coming from Israel without pedagogic training, And so you have to take a chance on someone who's newer to the field and gonna maybe make mistakes, but then they're penalized and it's very hard for them to get a job. So I would say that it's challenging, and I would come back to the quotes that I shared from the CASHI study, from Mapping the Marketplace, that I would love to have this conversation with those who are in hiring about how can we then, if we're saying that this is what we want and we're penalizing people for not having it, right? Like, well, they don't have an MA in Bible, or they don't have a rabbinic degree. At the same time, how it's working against them to be really, if we get back at that quote of, but we want someone who doesn't have too much, it was too much of a script. That was the line that I was thinking of. We don't want someone who's coming too much from a script. Well, then what's a teacher supposed to be, right? We don't want them to have too much of a script, because then they're just coming thinking about their studies. And, I definitely have a chip on my shoulder as someone who's leading a higher ed program right now, that higher ed across the country, this is not just in the Jewish world, it's in the general world too, is becoming less valued and less in vogue. Again, what bind does this put educators in? You're supposed to be really great and effective. You're supposed to inspire the next generations to talk about in the Jewish world, to love Judaism, to talk about God, to have theological conversations, to know his Jewish history, to love Israel, to be fighters against anti-Semitism, to have a strong Jewish identity, to know their Bible. Depending on the school you're in, they should also know all of the Tanakh. They know all that, but don't come with too much of a script. So, I think that we really have to not be fearful of laying all this on the table, not just from a gender perspective, but let's talk about the two sides of what we're saying, right? It's about both sides of the mouth. We want people who are really just energetic and we can mold within the school, but we also want people who are going to make sure that those who graduate from our school are going to be really committed Jews. Well, what is it that we want? And are we willing to talk about where we can find the balance, and how not one teacher can be all of everything? Every once in a while, I both know you have that one amazing teacher who can be all of everything. But really, what are we putting on teachers when we want them to be all of everything?
A few people mentioned other countries in their comments, and countries where the teaching profession is more respected and compensated better. And so I guess the question is, how do I even formulate this? I have to confess, I'm pausing because I keep thinking about the debates going on in Congress right now, and how we're so far behind other developed countries in terms of things like paid family leave and universal health care. But I guess, are the things you're talking about, are they kind of representative trends, or are we more in the outlier? Do you have a sense of that?
I can't really speak about comparing us. This is not my expertise, but I can say, I'm very tapped into that debate around family leave, and also, books that have been written over the past decade around the impossible bind that mothers particularly are in, and working mom. And as a working mom myself, it's really hard. So what I can name right here is intersection. Let's go back to early childhood. When we look at that quote around, we know, I'm sure collectively on this call, we all know someone who went into education. Maybe that was one of 20 things they could have done, but it's a good school day. It aligns with summer vacation. They have kids. And that quote really speaks to it. So were we setting the bar, I would say, too low for what we want for our teachers, or what is attracting teachers? Work-life balance should be one of the many things we're thinking about. But if, as particularly working women, we have to make the choice between, can I do the thing that I really want to do, even though it might be a very demanding job with different sorts of hours, or I have to do something where I know that I can be home at 3 and schools will provide that. And maybe the pay is not so great, but it's okay. I'll give that up because, I don't have any other way. I can't afford aftercare for my kids, right? And I can't afford summer camp for my kids. So this way I can be home with them, and that's one less expense. So what does our system set up for the low bar, particularly for working moms, around having to choose professions because we do not have childcare support as in other, we know specifically European countries. Denmark, Finland are two in particular that are raised up around the particular benefits they give so that families have that support from a very young age and you don't have to make these choices.
Maybe we can just close by going back to the cartoon, because I actually did a bunch more comments about it. The comments actually all focused on vacation and the notion that other professions did not have paid vacation. So there was something distinctive, sort of a distinct benefit, which right now we don't think of as a luxury. Now we think of that being paid vacation as being something that everyone should be entitled to some extent, but obviously it's not the case in every job. But I guess according to what people are commenting, that was very much the case for other women's professions at the time.
Yeah, and sorry, I just want to put in there that like what I dealt with for the whole time that I was a classroom teacher is my other friends. I said there was a lot of rolling of eyes of like, oh, you have your summers off. And I still had that when I was a professor here, you have your summers off. And also that's the real challenge. I think that there are some teaching programs where like teaching jobs where you solidly have off the month of July. But very rarely do you have your whole summer to loll on the beach, right? You're closing out in June. Maybe you have some time in July. And then in August, you're ramping up for the year. So what is it, the idea of, you're right, it is built into the package that you have these vacations, but I would argue also that we accept it as a very low bar in our country, that then you get to argue that you get paid less because you have all these vacations. You have all this time off. Your job ends at 3, which we also know for teachers is not the case, as we saw in those quotes.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's kind of astounding to me that my, the teachers in my son's school are expected to, reply to all these parent emails. I think people were commenting more on, back then, that in these other, secretaries or nurses, whatever it was, that people were arguing that they didn't have any paid vacation at all. Mm-hmm. But I just wanted to read you one kind of testimonial here. We can finish with this if you have a comment. I'm just going to read to you what this person wrote. So I grew up on the Upper West Side of New York during the late 40s and 50s. It was a marvelous time for public schools in New York. Private school was for those who couldn't make it in public school. Schools were closed on the Jewish holidays because there wasn't enough staff to open. I had a great school experience, homogeneous grouping, assured classes full of similarly gifted students. I can count on one hand the number of non-Jewish teachers I had. And then the person added, and they didn't encounter more non-Jewish teachers than Jewish teachers until they got to college. But then the person added that teaching was considered a good job for women because you would have vacation when your children were out of school. And someone else also chimed in that in the 60s, in the late 60s, that they were being encouraged, they and their friends were being encouraged by their parents to become teachers because of the schedules that you were just talking about. But I kind of liked that that picture of public school life in the 40s and 50s that this person was painting.
I love that. I think if there's more anecdotes, they would be really interesting to thread together. And I think that's a great way to end, because it comes back to why, there are many books about teaching out there, why I have such a love for my daughter, the teacher, because it really looks at the experience. And that's a great place to end. What do we miss when we're looking just at surveys or numbers and not looking? I'm a big fan of qualitative research. I'm not saying that's the only kind of research that's valuable, but qualitative research looks at interviews and case studies and the lived experience, whether it's of a teacher in the classroom or of those who were with teachers in a classroom. And I think that's a great place to end. How can we lift that up more from then And then now, as we're trying to make decisions and real concrete decisions about funding and where our Jewish funders are putting dollars and what we're investing in, to really think about what is the experience of the classroom.
Thank you so much for teaching us today. I feel like we could have talked a lot more about the pandemic and how it's bringing out so many of these issues so much more. But I think at this point we sort of take that for granted, how much the pandemic is just lifting up and exacerbating so many of these issues. But thank you for sharing this expertise with us.
Thank you.
It's such a nice, such a nice contemporary lens in the theme of this series. I want to thank everyone for coming and invite you back next week for a different session, very different kind of session, but somewhat similar, with Dr. Jonathan Ray, who is our JTS alumnus and now professor at Georgetown, and he'll be teaching on Jewish work and Jewish identity in the Middle Ages. So we will see, Dr. Epstein, what comparisons do we encounter perhaps between his session and yours. But thank you again for teaching. Thank you to our sponsors for today. Thanks to all for joining us, and hope to see you again next week. Take care.
Thank you so much.